You talk in the article about the need and the importance of cosmopolitan museums as great cultural institutions for society and the world, and the threat to that posed by the movement to repatriate artifacts to their country of origin and to think of art as a national pride issue rather than a product for the world at large. How do you see those kinds of issues?
Well, first, I think we have to look at the word repatriate and the kind of promiscuous use of that word, because it's a word, as you very well know, that really is applied to the return of prisoners of war. And so these objects are being cast in the light of being held prisoner from their homeland, as it were. And the use of the word repatriate means to bring them out of imprisonment to their rightful place at home.
So the movement to repatriate art is really a kind of based on the idea that art has been stolen and is being kept prisoner in the new countries and should be liberated and sent back to its homeland.
Yes, and on the assumption that it has a homeland, that it's got some generic and a place in this particular part of geography, as human beings do, as if it was born there and has a citizenship with this place and should be returned to that country of its origin. And then that use of that word repatriation is to elicit a kind of emotional response, a sense that these things share with the individuals who live within that polity now an identity. And so that this ancient object that may be 2,000, 3,000 years old, that was made for whomever, but not certainly for the modern state, has a place in the modern state.
So Greek and Roman art. So the victory of Samothrace is, like Rousseau, a citizen of the world, not limited to a particular national community at this time.
We're talking about things that are in the public domain, that are in museums, and that are in contexts in which they're seen in relationship to each other, and where you see that the works of art have always been made out of contact with new and foreign stimuli, that they're not anything that was contained within a political parameter that have distinct identities associated with that political parameter, but rather works of art, artists have always moved about, they've always seen new things, strange things, provoked interest in making new things. So what we're trying to do by making a claim for the Encyclopedic Museum as a kind of a cosmopolitan institution is to encourage people to be curious about the world, to look for similarities rather than differences, and to note that these differences are the differences of circumstances, not the differences of nature.
But is there a difference between seeing a piece of art that's been ripped from its cultural and historical context and placed in some new one, as opposed to seeing it in its place of origin and time of origin? I mean, if you look at the cloisters in Upper Manhattan, is that the same thing as seeing them back where they were? If you look at the Temple of Dendor at the Met, is that the same as seeing it back in Egypt?
You'll never return objects to their original state of origin. I mean, that is because the circumstances have changed. So if the Temple of Dendor, which of course was exported from Egypt legally with the encouragement of the Egyptian authorities, nevertheless, if that went back to Egypt, it wouldn't go back to pharaonic Egypt. It would go back to contemporary Egypt. So the circumstances are not just physical circumstances, they're not just how something looked in landscape, but they're how something looks in a developing organic cultural environment. And so there are other aspects of context. That is, there's not just a single content that has the authority over all other contexts. There's a new context within a museum in which one sees a work of art in the context of other works of art. And so one sees that in that context that works of art have a certain similarity that provokes questions about human contact and historical evaluation. So I think that we shouldn't privilege one context over another. And in fact, what I think we want to do in these encyclopedic museums or cosmopolitan institutions is to encourage curiosity about the world. This curiosity, especially at a time of resurgent nationalism and sectarian violence, is something that I think could prove to be beneficial in the world. People are living across borders in numbers greater than ever before. And so we want people to be curious about their neighbors who come from different places, who have different cultural values that are now trying to be integrated into a common context. So the more that we can encourage this kind of curiosity about the world, the difference in the world, the better. And I think that's what we want our museums to do.
You talk in the article about how you first encountered some great artifacts in the Louvre and how this really exposed you to new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing, and how that helped form your view. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I was 19 years old and I was a traveling student and I made my way into the Louvre. And in those days, in the late 60s, there were very few people in the Louvre, and so you can wander at will without the bustle of crowd around you, and you can be therefore attracted to things that seem strange to you. And this one, this great early Assyrian piece, there was this kind of commanding presence of this strangeness about it that attracted my attention, and I began to look at it, and I began to read the label. I knew nothing from which it came. I knew nothing about the date, nothing about the context, but there was something about it that attracted my attention. And I looked at this thing, and I remember years later reflecting upon that experience, that I must have looked at it as if the original makers looked at it. I mean, there was no real distinction between that original maker looking at this object that he made and my looking at this object he made, and all the people in between that person and myself. So I was an unbroken line of observers onto this object that felt drawn to this object, and all of a sudden we were part of a family, of a certain kind of relationship with people, and so there was a sense of a collapse of time and a collapse of difference, and there's no reason why I can't have that same kind of grasp of this object that the original maker had, or the people in the original context had, and we can bridge those differences by the power of attraction that works of art have over us.
But cultural theorists might argue that kind of gaze is a kind of proprietary, imperial, penetrating gaze, that the artifact was ripped by colonial masters from its original context and taken to the metropole, and that therefore what you were doing is engaging in and perpetuating a kind of a narrative of domination and an active domination against the sort of subaltern peoples whose art it was, and that therefore the Elgin marbles should be in Greece rather than England, and the Etruscan art should be back home rather than here. You just don't buy that at all?
I don't buy that at all. If the things have been removed legally in the circumstances of the time in which they were removed, and we know from the Parthenon marbles they were in fact removed legally because the Ottoman authorities gave Elgin permission to remove them. So if you're looking for evidence of empire in museums, you'll see it everywhere because it's an historical fact. We can embrace that history and look beyond that history, be critical of that history, and include it as part of our own history. But I don't think it's a matter of just trying to retrace and correct the imbalances of power of the past.
And so, in effect, the great museums that may have been in part the heirs of imperial projects can nevertheless, in the present era, help transcend that kind of history by bringing cultures and multiculturalism to people, whoever comes to visit them.
Yeah, I think it can. And there are sort of imperial ambitions that modern nation states have, and in those imperial ambitions, they're not. It's to ennoble their own power and presence in the world by reflecting on their own greater glories of the past that they claim to be their inheritance, rather than in overpowering other cultures in the world. I think it's an impulse that people have. It's an impulse that one could be critical of, but nevertheless it isn't an impulse that one can eliminate, especially from the past. One can identify it and be critical of it, but it is what it is.
Are there real issues in the art world and art trade today of looting, of artifacts being sold on the black market? Even if legal transactions are legit, would encouraging that simply open the floodgates for a whole variety of illegal transactions as well?
I don't think the legal transactions would open the floodgates of illegal transactions, but there are illegal transactions going on in the world, so we are told, and I'm willing to believe. I mean, I have no contact with it, so I can't tell you in fact that that's the case. And what's an area of the world in which that's now being emphasized is Syria. And there's certainly destruction of the ancient legacy of the ancient world in Syria, and there's even looting of, I assume, and it's said that the looting feeds ISIS, and it's with oil the means of their sort of financial support. And it's said that the looting occurs by these objects being taken from Syria across the border into Turkey and then sold into the black market. The big question is, where are they going if that's the case? If this is a big financial contribution to the coffers of ISIS, and the numbers you hear are millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions, that's a lot of money. And I don't think we yet know how that translates from these objects that are being looted to these numbers of dollars, and where they're going and where they resurface. But nevertheless, it's a horrible, tragic situation, the result of war destruction and sectarian violence, and it's got to be stopped. And the only place it can be stopped is at the borders.
As the head of the Getty, you're one of the great cultural gatekeepers and enforcers in the American cultural world, certainly, but even in the world more generally. How do you establish a sort of a scale of authoritative value in such a subjective area as art and culture?
Well, we don't do it alone. We have advisors in every part of what we do, whether it's in conservation around the world, whether we're working in the Valley of the Queens in Egypt or King Tut's tomb in Egypt, or whether we're working with conservators and on panel paintings in Central Europe or wherever it might be. It's always with advisors who bring to us their collective wisdom to help us understand, so that we're not working just from our own interests, but what we understand to be the interests of the discipline, of the domain of which we're a part.
What's your single favorite artifact or work of art in the Getty?
You know, everyone asks that. It's always impossible to say, but I would say a painting by Andrea Mantegna, the great late 15th, early 16th century northern Italian Venetian area painter, which is a painting of the Adoration of the Magi. And it's extremely beautiful, that evokes the kind of compression of bas-reliefs from the Roman world, which was influential on him, but it's got the extraordinary lightness and deftness of touch, both in terms of the emotion of the figures as they're expressed in the faces, the visuals involved, but in just the pure quality of the paint on linen.
Jim Cuno, thank you very much. Good talking with you.
Yeah, great pleasure. Thank you.